Chapter 2. The Truth Hidden Under the Sand Dunes. When I was a child, during the summers, I went to my grandmother's house in the humble fisherman's village of Caleta Vidal on the coast of Peru. By then, we already knew that we were surrounded by pre-Incan cemeteries, mostly from the Chankay pre-Incan culture. We often found ancient pieces of tapestry and ceramic under the sand, as well as bones and skulls. But just recently, my family became aware that grandmother's house was sitting on a land that in remote times used to be a part of the area of the ancient Caral civilization. A couple of miles away from the fisherman's village, 8 pyramids were excavated just a few years ago. And when they finish excavating, there will be a total of 32 pyramids. Recently, I returned to my grandmother's house after 25 long years. Something felt different in the house now that Grandma had gone back to the stars, but mostly everything looked exactly as I had left it since my last visit. The adobe walls were still decorated with marine landscapes from all over the world that my aunts had cut from magazines. The same old bedroom was waiting for me at the end of the house, but now it seemed smaller than how I remembered it. Wondering how so many children used to fit in such a small room, I fell asleep smiling, surrounded by the sounds and smells of the best times of my childhood. A very strong dream arrived in the middle of the night. It was nighttime in the dream as well. From a big fire placed in the center of a stone altar, ancient indigenous people moved towards me like shadows. One of them was an old woman, calling me, inviting me to come closer. Then I abruptly woke up and, half asleep, walked with the help of a flashlight directly to a room in the house that was being used for storing very old furniture. And there was Juanita. My grandfather used to go to the sand dunes some nights to find old pieces of pottery. And one morning he came back home with a skull in his hands. He said it belonged to a woman and called her Juanita. He and Grandma decided that from then on she would be the guardian of the house. I was very surprised when my flashlight spotted her skull. It felt so good to see her again. I remembered being afraid of her when I was little, but now that she had showed herself in my dreams and woken me up in the middle of the night, I was thrilled and happy. I accepted the invitation received in my dreams, and the next day took off towards the pyramids and ceremonial spaces of the ancient Caral nation. Thanks to a very kind local gentleman who was hired to work with the archaeologists and served as my guide, I quickly understood what my eyes were seeing. Essentially, the Caral people, as ancient as the Egyptians, were people of the beginning. Our first grandfathers in South America who did not know war. I was very impressed to hear that at Caral no weapon has ever been found by the archaeologists. I was also relieved now that the truth had emerged from those old sand dunes. Instead of weapons, what they found by the hundreds were musical instruments, with lots of one-tone flutes among them. Finally, the truth that I always felt was revealed in front of my eyes. The old scientific theory that says war is what determines the development of a civilization was proven to be wrong. Music, on the other hand, as the art of elevating vibrations and putting them in the air so they may go everywhere and nourish all beings, was essential for those from whom we originally descend. The pyramids, sacred fireplaces, and all the powerful ceremonial spaces of Caral were the sacred containers for the thousands of souls who played the instruments and created the vibrations. Imagine them, thousands of people all together under the stars, the fires lit in the temples that surrounded them, sending the sounds of their flutes out to the universe. It is commonly known by indigenous people that high frequency vibrations activate consciousness, nourish what is hungry or weak, heal what is sick, and invite in the most luminous forces of nature. Because of my experience with indigenous sacred ceremonies, it became clear to me that the main focus in the minds of the Karal people was taking care of all that lives. They did not see themselves as conquerors or competitors. They saw themselves as caretakers of life. Our first grandfathers, far from being interested in greedy, conquering ventures, were occupied with adding beauty and power to the beautiful earth that gave them their bodies and the food and water that nourished them. Considered that they did not have any defensive structures or weapons, they must have always been open in their hearts and willing to share with others what they had. Therefore, I believe their economic system was based in generosity and reciprocity, as it still is nowadays in many indigenous communities. With generosity and reciprocity, they took care of all living creatures without exception, their heart following the good example of the rains that fall on everyone and of the sun that doesn't exclude anyone from receiving its light and warmth. In Peru, a waka, such as Caral, Chavin, or Machu Picchu, is a sacred place, a center of spiritual power and of ancestral memory. Some wakas are hundreds of years old, and some, like Caral, are many thousands of years old. When my cousins and I were little, we had many places where we could go and play, but I always liked to go play in a waka. Something invisible that lived there made me feel peaceful. It was exciting to suddenly find a piece of old pottery or a piece of pre-Incan tapestry, and right away start imagining the people who lived there so long ago. When I was old enough to travel by myself, I started going to Cusco and to other locations along the Andean mountain range where I visited many beautiful wakas, Machu Picchu among them. Back then, there weren't that many tourists, so I could stay for a long time in the temples, walk in silence, pray, and receive the memory and instructions that our ancestors left recorded in the stones. When you sit quietly and long enough, staring at one of the stones that our ancestors shaped and carved, eventually the stones start talking to you. In some way, it shows you the world that the ancient people saw through their eyes. What a magic world that was. Our ancient grandfathers had a mind very different than ours. Their mind was really free and wise, naturally connected to the sacred motion of the cosmic forces. They built a world on Earth which was like a mirror, where the cosmic dance could reflect itself and resonate, and where all beings could receive the nourishment of this vibration. When seeing the remains of ancient temples in places like Egypt, Guatemala, Peru, and many others, it is evident that the work of creating these sacred mirrors to produce and freely share high frequency vibrations was extremely important to them. The amount of effort they put into this task can be easily appreciated. Nowadays, someone might say that this was part of the artistic and mystic veins of the ancient ones, and that hunting and growing food to have a strong economy must have been their priority, but it wasn't. What today may be considered art or mysticism, for the ancient ones was crucial. for the sustenance of life.